Okay, picture this. You're staring at a complex legal problem question in an essay exam. You know the law, you've studied the cases, but um, getting it all down in a way that screams distinction, well, it feels daunting, right?
It really does.
How do you organize your thoughts, make sure you hit all the points, and actually show the markers you know how to think like a lawyer? If that resonates with you, you are absolutely in the right place today.
Hmm.
We've had a listener send in a stack of incredibly helpful sources, everything from academic takes on legal writing to practical guides and student insights, all focused on mastering one fundamental tool, the IRX method.
That's right. IRAC issue, rule, application, conclusion. It's often the first legal problem-solving framework students learn, particularly in those core subjects like torts, criminal law,
Hmm.
property, what we often call black letter law.
Right, the established rules.
Yeah, exactly. Meaning areas with, well, established technical rules. But as these sources really reveal, IRAC isn't just an acronym. It's a kind of disciplined way to approach legal analysis. And it's pretty crucial for success in law school and, frankly, beyond.
Absolutely. So our mission today, pulling from these listener-provided sources, is to really deep dive into IRAC. We want to extract the absolute most important nuggets, especially the practical tips that will help you not just understand the structure, but actually use it to, elevate your legal writing and confidently tackle any problem question thrown your way. Let's jump in.
Let's do it.
So let's start simple. What exactly is IRAC according to these materials?
Well, at its core, IRAC is essentially a standardized structure. It's primarily used for organizing answers to legal problem questions. The sources describe it as a framework, almost like a container for your legal analysis.
A container.
Yeah, one analogy that stuck with me from the reading is thinking of IRAC as the pitcher. And your legal analysis itself is the water inside. The pitcher gives it shape and form, right? But the water is the actual substance.
That's a great way to put it. It's the organizational paradigm, not the analysis itself.
Precisely. It structures your thinking. And while IRAC is definitely the most common, the sources do mention variants you might encounter, things like CREAC or ISACs.
Right, I've seen those.
But the fundamental concept, identify a legal problem, state the relevant law, apply that law to the facts, and then reach a conclusion that remains pretty consistent across the board.
And where are you going to use this? Typically.
Typically, yeah, you'll see IRAC structures in the discussion section of a legal memo or, say, the argument section of a brief. And crucially, within a single problem question, you'll often use a completely separate, self-contained IRAC analysis for each distinct legal issue or even sub-issue you identify,
Okay.
often under its own subheading, just to keep everything crystal clear for the reader.
That makes sense. Keep it organized. Okay, let's break down each letter then, starting with I issue. How do these sources suggest we identify and state the issue properly?
Okay, issue. Well, identifying the issue is where your knowledge of the law first really comes into play. You need to read the facts and spot where a legal rule might be implicated or where there's a point of controversy.
Spot the problem.
Spot the problem, exactly. An issue statement, as defined in the sources, is essentially a combination of the relevant legal rule and the specific facts that raise a question about that rule's application. It's asking, given these facts, what specific legal question needs to be answered here?
And they give us a helpful template for phrasing it, don't they? The whether-when structure. Can you give us an example of that?
Sure. So instead of just writing battery as your issue, you'd phrase it as something like, the issue is whether Don committed a battery when he pushed Pam during the argument.
Okay.
See how that phrasing immediately links the legal concept battery to the specific facts, Don pushing Pam. The sources do note some professors might prefer slightly different wording, maybe starting with did or can, but the function is the same. And a common stylistic preference, certainly in legal writing, is to state the issue as a statement of the question to be resolved, rather than posing it as a direct question with a question mark at the end.
Got it. Linking the rule and facts right from the start in the issue statement. Okay, moving on to our rule. What's the purpose of this section and, what goes into it?
Okay, the rules section. Its purpose is really to lay out the relevant law that will govern the issue you've just identified. You're providing the necessary legal context for the analysis that's about to follow.
The legal foundation.
Exactly. The sources rightly point out that the rule and the facts of your problem are, quote, inextricably linked. You select the rules because of the facts presented in the scenario.
So it's not just stating a case name or a statute number. What exactly do we need to include to make it effective?
No, definitely not just listing things. This is where you explain the law comprehensively. You'll need to include the specific legal rule itself, any tests the rule requires, the elements that make up that rule.
Elements are key.
Absolutely. Definitions of any legal terms of art. Those words with very specific meanings in law and any relevant exceptions, limitations, or defenses that might apply. Think of it like providing the user manual for the legal principle you're about to apply.
A user manual, I like that. And how should we structure this user manual? Any tips there?
Yeah, the sources suggest a kind of funnel approach. Start with the broadest principles and then narrow down to the specific components, the elements, and any applicable exceptions or defenses.
Broad to specific.
Right. You should also present your legal authorities in order of importance. Constitution first, then statutes, regulations, then case law. And it's critical, really critical, to explain the whole rule and define those terms of art.
Don't assume the reader knows.
Never assume. And if you're using cases, you need to briefly state the relevant holding and perhaps only the essential facts or conclusions necessary to illustrate how the rule operates. Don't just, recount the entire case history. You're explaining the law, not just listing sources.
All right, now for the A application or analysis. Reading through these sources, something that really jumped out at me is how much they all emphasize this section. They call it the most important part, the core of your argument, and they explicitly say it should be the longest part. Why is the analysis so critical for getting those top marks?
The A. Yes. This is where you truly demonstrate your understanding and, frankly, earn those higher marks, that distinction level. It's simply not enough to just state the rule. In the application section, you articulate why that specific rule applies, or maybe why it doesn't apply to the unique facts presented in the problem question.
So it's the why.
It is absolutely the why. This is where you apply critical thinking, you connect the abstract law to the concrete facts, and you build your actual argument. It's the difference between knowing the law and knowing how to use the law effectively. That's what markers are looking for.
Makes sense. And finally, C conclusion. What's the role here, and how should we wrap things up neatly?
The conclusion, well, it basically brings everything together. For each specific issue you've analyzed, using that IRAC structure, you'll state the outcome you reached based only on the application you just performed.
So if I tackled, say, 3 separate issues in my problem question, I'd have 3 mini conclusions, one for each.
Exactly right. You'll have a brief conclusion for each individual issue, often just a sentence or two. Then, if the problem question asks for it, you might have a final overall judgment that summarizes the outcome of all the issues combined.
Okay.
But the absolute key here, and this was stressed by all the sources, is do not introduce any new information in your conclusion. No new facts, no new rules. Your conclusion must flow directly and solely from your analysis.
Got it. Keep it tight. What about the tone?
Tone should be assertive. State your opinion based on your analysis. If it's a really close call, a difficult case, it's okay to state that the outcome is likely conditional or perhaps requires more facts. But if you can, state the most probable or fair outcome based on your analysis and briefly reiterate why. But remember, while the conclusion is, the destination, the journey, that detailed application section, that's where the vast majority of your marks are actually awarded.
Okay, so we've got the framework down. Issue, rule, application, conclusion. But you mentioned the difference between an average IRAC and a distinction level IRAC really lies in the quality of that analysis. The sources give us some really powerful practical techniques to make the A section shine. What's the fundamental principle they keep coming back to?
Yeah, the core principle, the thing you absolutely have to internalize, is this. You must make the connection between the rule and the facts explicit, crystal clear. You cannot assume the reader sees the link, however obvious it seems to you.
Don't make them guess.
Never. You have to show them step by step how the facts satisfy, or perhaps fail to satisfy, each element of the rule you've laid out.
And they highlight one word as perhaps the single most important word for forcing you to do this explicitly. What was that again?
Yes. Because. Or, similar linking words like as or since. Using because literally forces you to take an element of the rule you just stated and link it directly to a specific fact from the problem scenario.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Instead of writing, the defendant was negligent, he sped through a red light, which is just 2 separate statements.
Right, disconnected.
You'd write, the defendant was negligent because he sped through a red light, or the plaintiff's conduct meets the element of causation as her tripping over the rug directly led to her falling down the stairs. See how that word compels you to connect the legal concept to the factual event? It builds the bridge.
That's incredibly practical. It acts almost like a self-trick mechanism, doesn't it? If you can't put because or as between the rule element and a fact, maybe you haven't actually made the connection yet in your writing.
Precisely. It forces the analysis.
Yeah.
What's another technique they suggest for ensuring you're truly using the facts, not just listing them?
Ah, yes, the highlighting technique.
Well, before the highlighting, the core technique is deliberately using rule words and fact words together in the same sentence within your analysis section.
Okay, rule words and fact words together. How does that help?
It actively prevents you from falling into the trap of just summarizing facts in one paragraph and then stating legal conclusions in another separate paragraph. It forces you to integrate them, sentence by sentence.
And that's where the highlighting comes in.
Exactly. The sources even suggest a self-assessment trick. After you've written your analysis, go back and highlight rule words in one color, say yellow, and the specific fact words you've used in another, say green. Ideally, every single sentence in your analysis section should have both yellow and green highlighting.
Wow, that visual is so helpful. I remember they used the example of intentional infliction of emotional distress, IIED.
Yes, that was a good one.
If the rule requires extreme and outrageous conduct, and you've defined what that means in your rule section, using specific phrases from case law like beyond all reasonable bounds of decency, then your analysis needs to show how the specific facts meet that definition by putting those rule words and fact words together.
Precisely. So you wouldn't just say the neighbor's actions were bad. You'd write something much more specific, like the neighbor's actions constitute extreme and outrageous conduct yellow, which is beyond all reasonable bounds of decency yellow, because he deliberately knocked on the homeowner's door late at night and falsely claimed that the homeowner's daughter had been gravely injured in a bike accident green.
Okay, yeah.
There you see the rule words extreme and outrageous, beyond all reasonable bounds, directly linked via because to the specific factual conduct, the false claim about the daughter. It leaves absolutely no doubt in the marker's mind how you're applying the rule to those facts.
That makes so much sense. It forces precision. And they also emphasize using the full range of facts provided in the problem, right? The idea that professors don't just throw in random details for fun.
Exactly right. Assume every fact in the pattern is there for a reason. Maybe it triggers an element of a rule, maybe it suggests an exception, or perhaps it supports a counter-argument. Don't just grab the most obvious fact and move on.
Dig deeper.
Dig deeper. Scrutinize every sentence of the fact pattern and think, how could this relate to the elements of my rules? And importantly, you need to consider facts that support applying the rule and any facts that might argue against it. Show you've considered both sides.
How about using case law effectively in the analysis section? It's not just about mentioning cases in the rule part.
Good point. If you relied on a precedent case in your rule section to explain the law, your analysis is the place to compare the facts of that precedent case to the facts of your current problem. You need to explicitly state why the factual similarities or differences mean the rule from that precedent should apply, or maybe shouldn't apply, to your current facts.
So draw the parallel or distinction.
Exactly. This isn't just dropping a case name for show. It's demonstrating how that case helps you analyze the law in this specific situation. And the sources suggest using qualifiers like likely or unlikely when drawing these comparisons. It adds a layer of sophistication, acknowledging that legal outcomes aren't always, black and white.
Right, acknowledges the nuance. And finally, something the sources point out as a hallmark of really sophisticated legal thinking. Addressing counter-arguments. Why is that important?
Absolutely crucial for top marks. In your analysis, whenever it's relevant and possible, briefly consider the strongest argument for the opposite conclusion to the one you're reaching.
Play devil's advocate for a moment.
Sort of, yeah. This shows the marker that you understand the nuances of the issue, you've considered alternative interpretations of the facts or the rules, and you can actually anticipate challenges to your own argument. It demonstrates a deeper, more critical engagement with the legal problem. It's a sign of strong legal thinking. Now, mastering IRAC isn't just about the writing itself, is it? The process you use to approach a problem question, especially under exam pressure, is equally vital. The sources really advocate for a structured approach. Read, think, write.
Simple but powerful. And they even give us a helpful rule of thumb for managing time, particularly in an exam setting. What was that again?
Yes, a rough guide, and it is rough, is to dedicate about 1/3 of your total time to reading the question and facts carefully and then thinking through your answer. And that thinking phase includes outlining.
Okay, 1/3 for reading and thinking outlining.
Right. The remaining 2/3 is for the actual writing. And the sources stress that students often skip or seriously rush the think part, which is usually a big mistake.
jumping straight to writing. I can see how that happens. So let's break down read, think, write. First, read with intention. What does that involve exactly?
It really starts with reading the call of the question.
Mhm.
First, what specific question are you being asked to answer or advise on? This gives your initial read of the fact pattern direction and focus.
Know your target.
Precisely.
Yeah.
As you then read the facts, you're not just absorbing a story, you're actively hunting for those legally significant or outcome-determinative facts, the ones that will trigger specific legal rules or be crucial to applying them.
Hmm.
The sources suggest marking or highlighting these key facts. Some even recommend using different colors based on which IRA say section I, R, A, or C they seem most relevant to, even before you start writing your outline. You're constantly asking yourself, why did the professor include this specific detail?
That sounds like active reading, like legal detective work. Okay, after reading and marking up the facts, you move to think outline. What does that look like?
This is creating your roadmap, your plan of attack. It doesn't need to be super detailed, but a brief outline for each issue you've identified is key. State the rule you plan to use and, crucially, list the specific facts from the scenario you plan to apply to each element of that rule.
Listing the facts per element.
Yes, and here's a critical tip from the sources.
Yeah.
If you map out a rule element in your outline and then realize you don't actually have any relevant facts in the problem to apply to it, well, maybe that rule element shouldn't be a focus for that specific issue's analysis.
Ah, that is a huge tip. It stops you from going down rabbit holes or trying to force facts where they just don't fit. Keeps your analysis tight and relevant.
Exactly. It keeps you focused. And finally, write with structure.
Following the plan.
Following the plan. With your outline as your guide, you write your answer following that IRAC structure we've discussed. Start a new, distinct IRAS analysis for every separate issue or major rule you address. This structured approach ensures you're systematic, you cover all the necessary ground logically, and your argument progresses clearly from identifying the problem to reaching a conclusion that's actually supported by your analysis.
And throughout this whole read, think, write process, the core message seems consistent with what we discussed about making the A section shine. Show your work.
Absolutely. 100%. Never, ever assume the reader, the marker, knows the connection between a fact you've mentioned and a rule you've stated. You have to explicitly explain that logical link using techniques like because and integrating rule and fact words. Your marks come from demonstrating your reasoning process, not just magically arriving at the correct outcome. It's truly about the journey of your analysis. And based on the sources, particularly looking at insights from studies where students actually self-assess their own IRAC essays against model answers, we can pinpoint some really common reasons students unfortunately lose marks.
Oh, that's useful. What are the typical pitfalls?
They often fall into roughly three categories. First, there are law-based issues, things like not fully knowing the rules, misunderstanding elements, or missing exceptions. Second, fact use issues. This is a big one, like just summarizing the story instead of actively using specific facts in the analysis, or the one-and-done mistake, where they only use one fact for an element when multiple facts might be relevant.
Okay, law and fact use. What's the third?
The third is writing problems. This ties into the analysis techniques we discussed. Things like fact listing, just dropping facts without linking them to rules, or making conclusory statements like, therefore, there was negligence, without showing the step-by-step application of the rule elements to the facts that leads to that conclusion.
That self-assessment research sounds really insightful because it gave a window into what students often struggle with seeing in their own work, right? Comparing their own IRAC responses to expert ones must have highlighted some blind spots.
It really did. The study mentioned in the sources found students often struggle to articulate specifically what was wrong with their own analysis and, more importantly, how to actually fix it.
Hmm.
They often realized, after comparison, that they needed to be much more detailed in their rule sections, including those sub-definitions and smaller components of rules we talked about. And the process itself, the importance of outlining, of spending sufficient time thinking before writing that, was something many only fully appreciated after going through that reflective self-assessment exercise.
So it really reinforces that learning legal writing isn't automatic. It's a skill that requires deliberate practice and, crucially, reflecting critically on your own application of the rules and facts. You need to see where the gaps are.
Exactly. Deep reflection is key.
So bringing it all together then, why is mastering IRE, and especially these specific techniques for crafting a strong analysis section, so crucial if you're aiming for that distinction grade? Why does it matter so much?
Well, because Achieving high marks in law school, getting that distinction, isn't just about regurgitating information learned in lectures. It's fundamentally about demonstrating your competency to think and act like a lawyer.
Showing the skill?
Showing the skill, yes. By performing concise, structured legal analysis using the IRA framework, you are showing the markers that you can engage deeply with the law, that you can work specifically to the facts provided, what lawyers call working to the brief, and that you can think independently by applying often abstract rules to new, unfamiliar factual situations. It proves you understand the fundamental structure of legal problem solving, which is essential for practice.
So it really is about the quality of your reasoning and how clearly you articulate it, using the specific facts and the IRSE framework as your tools. And even when the answer might be uncertain or debatable, demonstrating your thorough analytical process is what earns you the marks.
Precisely. It's the journey, the showing of your work, that counts heavily, especially for those higher grades.
Okay, wow. We've covered a lot today. We've broken down the fundamental IRSE structure, issue, rule, application, conclusion. We've dove deep into some really powerful techniques to make that all-important analysis section shine, like using because and consciously combining rule and fact words. And we've walked through the essential read, think, write process for tackling legal problems effectively. It seems clear that mastering this framework isn't just an exam trick. It's really the systematic way lawyers approach disputes and advise clients in the real world.
That's absolutely right. And really honing that framework, particularly focusing on elevating your analysis by explicitly linking rules and facts using those concrete techniques we discussed, that's absolutely key to moving your legal writing from just, competent or average to truly excellent and achieving the distinction you might be aiming for. It takes practice, but it's achievable.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for diving deep into legal problem solving and IRAC with us today.
My pleasure. And maybe here's something for you, the listener, to ponder as you practice applying these techniques. If the core task in legal reasoning is applying these general, often quite rigid rules to specific, frequently messy, ambiguous, and uncertain facts, how does the discipline of a structured framework like IRAC prepare you not just for a controlled exam setting, but for navigating the inherent uncertainty and, let's face it, the subjectivity you'll inevitably encounter in real-world legal practice?
That's a great question. How does structure help with ambiguity? Definitely something to think about. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.